Hello, and welcome to The Lady Detects, an extremely brief history of women in detective literature. We're just going to hit some high points here, as we've discussed a lot of these, the influences on the development of a lady detective as we've been discussing the development of detectives. But I did want to hit on a few things. Now, in the early stages, detective stories typically featured women mainly in the roles of victims. There are some notable exceptions, of course, but Edgar Allan Poe himself once observed that the death of a beautiful woman, he said, was the most poetic topic in the world. Which, yes, that should give you the willies. It's pretty gross. But it's no surprise with that kind of attitude at its beginning that a lot of detective fiction, even today, centers on the death of women, particularly if it is a grisly, violent, or sexualized death. But there is a history of females as detectives, not just as corpses or clients in detective fiction. And it's worth noting a few of the moments that have had the biggest impact on this development. And that's what we're going to talk about today. From the beginning, women such as Meta Fuller Victor, who was a British woman, and Anna Katharine Green, who was American, published many detective stories in the mid to late 1800s. In fact, Green's detective, Amelia Butterworth, that was her fictional detective, served as a major inspiration for lots of the female detectives that have followed her. From the beginning, these female detectives were notable not just because they were as capable as their male counterparts, but because they brought a distinctly feminine viewpoint and approach to mysteries. They relied on their knowledge of human nature and relationships, the dynamics between people, emotions, their knowledge of all of that to solve the mysteries, rather than the brute force or superior intellect that we've seen in more traditional male detectives. They aren't physically tough. They aren't even necessarily some kind of Sherlock Holmesian intelligence. They are more aware of and knowledgeable about people. And that's where their strength lies. Even in the hyper-masculine world of dime novels, many female detective series were quite popular, and they grew on this idea. But certainly in the early 20th century, two main female detectives became the biggest deals. One was Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, Miss Jane Marple, and that picture that you're looking at right now, that is of the many actresses who've played her, that is the one I like the best, that I think does the best job of Miss Jane Marple. And then Dorothy Sayers' Harriet Vane. They were the most prominent and memorable and most recognizable female detectives of the early 20th century. Miss Marple is a spinster, much like Amelia Butterworth, and this is where we can see a lot of Anna Katharine Green's influence with Amelia Butterworth on what came next. Miss Jane Marple is like her, a spinster, meaning she's unmarried, she doesn't have children. That gives her a lot of time and freedom to investigate cases. Much like how we see Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes, they are unmarried without kids. The private eyes of Hard-Boiled, they're unmarried without kids. That allows them the freedom to kind of throw themselves into these investigations. Well, Miss Jane Marple was the same. But unlike Holmes and unlike even Poirot, Miss Marple doesn't avoid emotion and empathy. She doesn't see those as beneath her. She remains acutely interested in the relationships between people, which gives her insight into their characters and their behavior. But she's also able to disarm people a little bit with both her traditional kind of British, politeness, and as we saw in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, her, that kind of cultural politeness and wanting everything to be tidy and prim and correct, but also because of her age and because she is a spinster. Suspects and police alike don't typically take her seriously, at least not at first. They routinely underestimate her, which she's able to use to her advantage. Harriet Vane, Dorothy Sayers' major female detective, is first introduced as a suspect that is on trial for her life, and she is proven innocent by Sayers' most well-known detective, Lord Peter Wimsey. He proves her innocent, and then after that book, Harriet Vane and Peter Wimsey join forces, ultimately even get married. Harriet Vane is a very smart and formidable detective. But one thing that is true about her is that in many of her books, she still needs the help of Lord Peter Wimsey, her husband, and both his skills and his reputation and his high class in British society in order to be able to, actually finish up the detecting. So while she can run the engine of the detective work, we still see kind of a issue where she's not taken enough seriously and doesn't have enough agency to do it on her own. Now, the 1940s were a chaotic time in much of the world, as we've already discussed, particularly in the US and Britain. During World War I and World War II, men went into battle, and large amounts of men went into battle, which left the women that were at home, they had to take care of the home front. They went to work in factories. They took control of businesses. They had to do that work because the men weren't there to do it. Even though lots of women, particularly lower socioeconomic class, women from lower socioeconomic classes and women of different ethnic backgrounds had always been having to work. But at this period of time, unprecedented numbers of American and European women had to enter the paid labor force. But then the men came home at the end of World War II, and they kind of wanted to slip back into their old roles and have the women slip back into theirs. That wasn't super easy for a lot of women, and certainly contributed to some of the developments as far as gender politics and dynamics happened in the later half of the 20th century, kind of grew out of, at least in part, from that time period. So those changing gender roles led to a lot of kind of shifting of how we see women. This new confidence and boldness among post-war women led to more literature in which the women acted as detectives, even if they weren't, employed as detectives, even if they weren't on the police force or they weren't getting paid for the work, they still did the activity of a detective, because more and more writers were looking at the agency women could have on the page to do things just as well as men. Alternatively, some female writers during this time focused instead on exploring the potential of women to be violent in their own right. Up until then, the conventional wisdom had held that women were softer and less violent and kinder and more maternal. And this is a time period where we started to see more and more writing. And you see this with the femme fatale in the hard-boiled genre, more and more writing that allowed the women to be bad and maybe go counter to what the traditional stereotypes were, and to even be violent and to be aggressive. And that often in those stories resulted from the internal struggles, or what were seen as the internal struggles, of being a woman in this changing time. The things you wanted and the things you have and the things you thought you would want and what's available to you, all of that being in conflict really led to some pretty evil female characters being written, or at least pretty violent and aggressive ones. But despite the success of these characters and these periods of time, for decades, the genre remained predominantly male in books and on the screen. Detective literature was about the men. And then we start making shifts. In the 1980s and 1990s, a few major pop culture successes started to change the game. The first of which was the American show Cagney and Lacey, which ran from 1982 to 1988 on CBS. Cagney and Lacey were New York City homicide detectives. And this was one of the first shows where there were two female leads. And because they were two female leads working in a male-dominated industry or profession, this show focused a lot on the challenges that kind of situation might bring. 1982 also saw the publication of Indemnity Only, Sarah Paretsky's first V.I. Warshawski novel. This began a series that was very long-running, following a female private investigator. The success of that series opened up a lot of kind of influence series that continue now of female private investigators. But this was the first time that had been done. And if you think about it, you know, if Hard Boiled was when we were focused on male private investigators, it took decades for us to get to where there was going to be a really successful female private detective. But probably one of the biggest influences that changed the game was the 1988 book and 1991 movie of Silence of the Lambs that starred Clarice Starling. Clarice was tough and smart, but very underestimated by her superiors. Both the book and the movie show Clarice Starling having to fight for the opportunity to investigate the case and talk to the big, bad, dangerous serial killer Hannibal Lecter. It is, when we're watching her do this, much like we'd seen in Cagney and Lacey and in Paretsky's novel, what we see is female characters who are tough and smart. They're not victims. They're not femme fatales. They're not using their sexuality or being used because of it. But they are having to face prejudices and challenges associated with being a woman in a traditionally male profession, especially a profession like detecting, which is one that has been so long characterized by machismo, toughness, violence. And they continue in the tradition of capitalizing on their stereotypically female traits, their vulnerability, their understanding of human relationships, even their aversion to violence, their wanting to avoid it, while still being active and exciting detectives. So they're a different kind of detective, and that's what allows them to be so successful. Since this time period, we have seen a lot of detectives, too many to count, both in movies, TV, and books, that are females. But these were some of the biggest ones that proved that female detectives could be exciting to readers and viewers alike. This week, we're going to be looking at a great example of how contemporary writers and directors have continued in this tradition while also challenging our preconceptions about women's roles and what it means to be a detective. We'll be watching Kahani, a 2012 Indian Hindu language mystery co-written and directed by Sujoy Ghosh. The movie stars Vidya Balan as Vidya Bagchi, a pregnant woman who goes to Calcutta to search for her missing husband. It includes a number of references to the insanely popular Satyajit Ray, a director who wrote a private investigator series following the Bengali detective Feluda, and he also set a lot of his movies in Calcutta. This film continues in the style of contemporary detective stories by having a strong sense of place, making Calcutta, its setting, a character of its own. In many of the scenes, you'll get to see what's called guerrilla filmmaking, which means these scenes were filmed on the streets of Calcutta without permits, without warning. The people walking around in the background didn't even know. And so what you see is a lot of the people in the background and many of the characters are real Calcutta residents, not actors. The goal was to create more of a sense of this place. And also the movie was made on a very small budget. And so this was a cheaper way to do it. But to play up the sense of place and realness, the film also uses almost only natural light. There's very little artificial lighting up the scenes, which gives it a maybe a bit darker feeling, a bit grimier feeling, but the hope would be also a realer, more realistic feeling. A little bit of cultural context. Many of the film's scenes play out against the real Durga Puja, a Bengali festival worshiping Durga, a Hindu warrior mother goddess who fights evil to protect creation. And yes, it is a pregnant woman as the investigator against the backdrop of a festival of a mother goddess who fights evil to protect creation. So that's interesting. It's a fun and suspenseful and surprising movie. I hope you enjoy it. And I look forward to discussing it and other female detectives with you in the future. Bye.